Hello, and welcome to our talk on navigating the ISCA archive. We're sorry we couldn't speak with you live, but a few of us, including me, should be available to answer any questions at the end. Today, we are going to introduce you to the International Sailing Craft Association, or ISCA for short, and all the amazing work that is going on to preserve this collection in a catalogued archive. So what even was the ISCA collection? The collection itself was put together by the work of David Goddard and encompassed a wide array of vernacular watercraft from all corners of the globe. However, David's museum was unfortunately closed in 1997, and the boats were further split up in 2017. Luckily for us, the boats were preserved through the recording conducted by staff and students from the University of Southampton. We now have an extensive amount of material to organise into a catalogue for the University of Southampton's special collection, and this led to the NAS and ISCA team launching an online course which took place over summer with an aim to encourage volunteers to get involved and help archive this fascinating collection. So, how did these 270 vernacular boats of different origins and purposes wind up together in a museum in Exeter? Well, Sue Goddard, the wife of David Goddard, recounted to us in an interview that the idea for the museum began with David waking up suddenly in the middle of the night with a desire to begin collecting boats from all over the world and set up a museum in which to display them. Perhaps not the most usual way of getting into the heritage sector, but nonetheless, David was determined to make his dream a reality. He was still in the army at the time, but was close to meeting the requirements for discharge, and so he presented his plans to the Exeter City Council, who agreed that once he left the army in 1965, he could make a museum out of some old warehouses on Exeter Quay and Canal Basin. As soon as David left the army, he began building his boat collection and set off for Bahrain due to contacts he'd made there whilst in the military service. The Pearling Dhow was specially built by the ruler of Bahrain and presented to David in his museum. Sue, in her interviews, shares many happy memories of sailing the dhow down the canal, and the collection has many more wonderful stories from all over the world regarding the boats and how they were collected. This map represents the geographical expanse of the collection, with the countries highlighted in purple representing places in which the ISCA collection had boats from. We thought we'd pick a few boats out of the vast number to share with you today. This first star represents the junk, also known as King, from South China. We next have the Sampan from Hong Kong, the Ibis that travelled on a great African expedition, the Tongan outrigger from the South Pacific. Then we have a boat a little closer to home, the Dutch pram dinghy from the Netherlands. Then we have the Garifuna canoe from Honduras, and last but by no means least, a coracle from Wales. This great range of geographic locations represented by only 7 boats gives us an idea as to just how expansive this collection really was. For example, David won the Winston Churchill Travelling Scholarship to Cultural Revolution China during the early 1980s. They were given permission to travel freely around China, looking for traditional boats for 2 months, which in itself was quite extraordinary, as Mao's regime was notoriously untrusting of Western visitors. Sue recounted to us that instead of paying for a translator like the Chinese officials insisted, they hired a student volunteer from the local university, hoping to improve their English language skills, to come with them on their expedition around China. Whilst there, they managed to obtain a daunting large sampan, as pictured here on the right, and the junk, as previously mentioned, from Hong Kong. The junk in particular had a varied life. Some of her stories include David sailing her down the Thames, and somewhere there is a photo of the junk outside the Houses of Parliament in London. She was even sunk in a harbour for divers to train in before being raised and sailed again. Each of these boats has a unique story, and we felt as a team it was important to share a few more. Here are 4 more short stories of some of the boats in David's collection that were indicated on the map earlier, and it was really hard to narrow down which ones we wanted to talk about. First is the Ibis, looking a little worn in the image on the top left. She was sailed during Boyd Alexander's Trans-Africa expedition during the early 1900s. This was a great but dangerous expedition with the goal of finding a water route between the Nile and the Niger. 2 of the 5 crew members lost their lives on this perilous journey, and despite the boat making its way back to the UK after the expedition, the boat was nearly lost, spending decades in a back garden until it was rescued and displayed by David in his museum. Next, on the top right, is the 1980s Tongan outrigger. She is an example of a very common form of small boat, used in the South Pacific. This boat in particular was gifted to the Duke of Edinburgh during the Queen's Jubilee visit to the South Pacific, and later donated to the collection. Third, on the bottom left, is the Dutch pram dinghy. This little dinghy was built by Van der Meer and Zoen in the 1930s. She was later used in May 1940 to help a Dutch couple flee from the Nazis as they occupied the Netherlands. And finally, on the bottom right, is a garifuna, sailing canoe, from Honduras. The garifuna are built by Afro-European Creole communities of subsistence fishermen and farmers. This boat presents a blend of European, African and Caribbean building traditions. These 4 boats in the preceding junk and sampan show the incredible breadth of small boats in the ISCA collection, as well as how motivated David was in bringing his idea into fruition. And whilst the idea for the museum may have been very spare of the moment in Sue's account, David had a very real reason for wanting to collect all these boats from around the world. Sue suggests that David's love of geography, the sea, and travel led him to find a passion in the preserve of these boats and a great appreciation of how these building traditions were fast disappearing as the world developed. As people began to recognise what David was trying to achieve with his museum, more boats were donated to the charity, including the Tongan outrigger, as previously mentioned. Help was also provided with the transportation of these boats. For example, the Ellerman Line shipping company freely moved some of David's acquisitions, and in his gratitude, David named a small cluster of boats the Ellerman Collection. The Exeter Maritime Museum as a charity required the aid of the general public to keep it going, and attracted a whole host of volunteers to run it from behind the scenes. Significantly, these volunteers continue to meet up for a yearly barbecue, a whole 20 years after the museum closure. David's museum was a team effort of donations, collaborations and volunteers, and he succeeded in creating a world-renowned collection of small vernacular watercraft that continues to be important today.
So, the museum opened to the public in 1969, but unfortunately it ran into a lot of issues with the warehouse it was housed in. To combat this, it was actually one of the first heritage institutions to be awarded a grant by the National Lottery, as it started in 1994. However, when the lottery found out that the Exeter City Council wouldn't extend the museum lease, which was 25 years long, they decided not to donate to the museum. This subsequently led to the closure of the museum in 1997. Then the collection was bought by Andrew Thornhill, who transported them to Rostov. After this, in 2002, the collection was moved again to Eyemouth in Scotland, where they were used by the University of Southampton for student training and recording. Students were required to visit the boats as part of their Master of Arts degree in Maritime Archaeology, to give them exposure and get engaged with the range of types of boats, and also to document the boats before they got too damaged in the cold and damp environment of the sheds they were kept in. The records from this period include manual recording on proforma, photography, photogrammetry, and laser scanning. Thus, they produced the bulk of the physical documentation we later had to archive for our digital catalogue. Unfortunately, in 2017, the owner of the collection, Andrew Thornhill, faced bankruptcy, and thus the collection was up for auction. So the team had to act fast. How could they record as much information about the collection in as little time as possible? The answer was laser scanning done by Pat Tenner, the results of which you can see on the diagram. Since 2017, the collection has been scattered across the world once again. Some ended up in local museums, where they can showcase regional boat building traditions. Notable examples of this are China, Oman, and Gdansk in Poland. Gdansk was the latest of these, and before then the 15 vessels built by Valerie were moved to Suffolk and used again by the University of Southampton for archiving. One of them actually stayed hanging up in the university's Centre for Maritime Archaeology, so if you ever visit, you will now know its complex and extensive history. Many vessels, however, are still stored in warehouses, where they are not being had in the necessary conditions for good conservation, and are at a high risk of damage. Thus, producing a digital record is very important for the preservation of the collection.
Archiving the records. So once all of the data had been recorded, it was now important to archive all of the data. As the collection had been auctioned off across the world, it was important to have all of the data in one place in an easy and accessible format. In fact, before lockdown, the paper records were stored inside of a longboat hanging from the ceiling of the CMA at the University of Southampton. The cataloguing of the files began before lockdown. However, in March, the country obviously went into the lockdown and recording had to be put on hold. The archiving process then had to be adapted, and a lot of files were scanned in so they could be archived digitally. Because of the considerable detail, it was going to require many hours and many volunteers to help with the archiving process. What was ostensibly going to impede the recording of the collection actually turned into a positive, as the online nature of the recording meant people from all over the world and from many different academic backgrounds were able to participate. I personally wanted to be a part of the archiving because I'm very interested in archaeology and also come from Cowes in the Isle of Wight, so I've grown up in an environment surrounded by maritime culture and heritage. So on the 20th of June, everyone came together via a digital platform to learn the process of cataloguing, along with the history of the collection, to provide a context for our work. The first pieces of information to record were the reference number for the file and the vessel itself. This was very important to keep consistent, so as to keep the archive organised. The date was also recorded, as this will be important in determining the chronology of files in future research projects. The digital size of each file was then recorded, so the size of the catalogue as a whole could be calculated. Obviously, this is important when storing or downloading sections of the catalogue in the future. The presence of a scale was also recorded. However, because the documents were scanned in, the original size of the document was unknown, and the scales couldn't be used to determine the size unless the original was present. The inked/pencil, rolled/flat, and needs attention sections were not applicable to the scanned documents, as they're only relevant for the original documents in paper format. Hopefully it won't be too long before the continuation of the recording of the physical documents, COVID permitting. The authors were also noted as another way of organising/navigating the catalogue. The most detailed section of the recording was the description section. This involved extracting as much information from the file as possible, such as details of the vessel, the angle a picture was taken, any alternative names, and any other present dates data, etc. It was important to make the description as detailed as possible, so when the catalogue is complete, it can be easily navigated. For example, someone searching for a vessel under an alternative name to the one listed as the title can do so without having to comb through each of the files individually. There are many different types of files, such as pencil drawings, plans, detailed diagrams of sections of vessels, such as sewing, and even completely blank files that still needed recording. So this is an example of a file and description of the Tongan outrigger, which was mentioned previously in the presentation. As you can see, the title information as well as the presence of alternative names are listed in the description. And this is a file for the pram dinghy, also seen earlier, and this file contains a scan of a series of sketches of the boat and additional features. This is one of many files that are present for each vessel. And this is just another example of a photograph, not the pram dinghy. And when describing this, we would note, for example, the tear in the vessel, position the photograph was taken from, and anything else in the background too, such as the tyres in this particular example.
So, the collection is currently scattered across the globe once again. Why should we still care about it? The collection was unique in that there was a huge variety of vessels and where they were from, purpose and morphology. As you could see from the map beforehand, it had boats from over 30 different countries, from the Americas to Southeast Asia and Oceania, making it uniquely suitable for demonstrating the diversity of boat making techniques across the globe. Their purpose also varied. We see fishing vessels transporting cargo, travel and exploration, and even shelter, such as the umiak boat, which are considered a form of architecture as well as substitute for home of indigenous people of northern Canada. And even if they had the same purpose, no two vessels were exactly the same, as they were made with techniques specific to indigenous boat making traditions from different time and location. Thus, the collection main significance lay in displaying collective human ingenuity in watercraft making. It also had historical importance as in second half of 20th century fiberglass and motorized vehicles were rapidly replacing traditional boat making. So, ISCA collection, it's not a simple one, but it demonstrates that it's maritime history and maritime culture heritage of all the world. It demonstrates also the history and the culture of various indigenous people in different time and location. For this why, it's important to preserve information, photo plan and description of each boat while a lot of traditional watercraft are disappearing. The aim of the project is to record the collection itself, because the records that we have are from a museum that now does not exist, and many of the boats themselves are disintegrating due to years of unsuitable storage. So there is importance in archiving the file in order to preserve the history and the stories of the boat collection as a concept as well as preserving knowledge about the individual boat. For example, Diana's knowledge about the beginning of ISCA is from an interview that was part of the file she was archiving. Without creating the digital archive, all of this knowledge would have been lost. At the end of the project, we hope to have all the records and everything digitized because they are currently in paper format. Because of this, creating a digital archive has been a way to make sure that the watercrafts are recorded and stored in one place, easily accessible by anyone who wants to use them for research. Thus, both the original purpose of the collection, which are discovering, obtaining, restoring, preserving, and displaying of a cross-section of the world evolving working boats, and the vessels themselves are digitally preserved. We want to say this is a wonderful experience of all of us to be a volunteer and work together on this amazing project. We all have one purpose is to save and help to protect the information from disappearing. It was a passion and so much fun and exciting to help in saving maritime cultural heritage with NAS committee in such ISCA project. We have a lot of work and lot of things to do for ISCA collection. So if anyone interested and have a passion to do that, don't be hesitate and contact NAS committee or Abby and you can have all the information you need. At the end of our presentation, we want to thank you for your attention. Thank you, NAS, for this conference, and thank you, Southampton University. And personally, I want to thank NAS, Abby, and my colleagues for this amazing opportunity to work together. Actually, I spent my lockdown working and recording the file, and it was so much fun and a passion. Thank you so much.